The village was unlike any place I had ever been before. Nestled deep in the mountains, far from any city, it felt frozen in time. The roads leading to it were rough, barely more than dirt paths winding through thick forest. No phone service, no electricity, apart from a few dim lights powered by ancient generators. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on maps, where no outsiders ever went, except for people like me. I was a documentary filmmaker, drawn to forgotten places and the stories hidden within them. I had spent months traveling through remote regions, collecting folklore and legends that the modern world had left behind. But nothing I had encountered before prepared me for this place. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already darkening behind towering cliffs. The village was small, no more than a dozen wooden houses built along a narrow, winding road. A few villagers were outside, chopping wood, carrying water. They paused when they saw me. Their eyes lingered for too long, their expressions unreadable. I had been warned beforehand that the locals might be wary of strangers, so I kept my distance, nodding politely. I wasn't here to disturb anyone, just to listen and learn. At first, everything seemed normal. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, their dialect thick and difficult to understand. But they were not unkind. An older man directed me to the village elder's home, a small but well-kept wooden house at the far end of the road. The elder, a man who introduced himself as Masaru, greeted me with a quiet nod. His face was lined with age, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Over a simple meal, we talked. I asked him about the village's history, its traditions, its beliefs. He answered carefully, as if weighing every word before he spoke it. But then, as the conversation wound down, he said something that made the air in the room shift. "You must never look into their eyes." I blinked. "Who?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the window, where the sun had just begun to dip behind the mountains. A long, tense silence filled the room. Then, he leaned forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. "If you see them, you must turn away." A cold chill crept up my spine. "Who are they?" I asked again, more cautiously this time. Masaru's expression darkened. "You do not want to know." I wanted to press further, but something about his tone, the absolute, unwavering certainty, made me stop. Instead, I tried a different approach. "Is this an old story? A legend?" Masaru exhaled sharply, as if frustrated. He shook his head. "It is a warning." At that moment, the door creaked open. I turned, startled, as an old woman stepped inside. She was small, hunched over, her hair a tangled mess of white strands. She had the look of someone who had seen too much, lived too long. Without a word, she walked right up to me and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Her nails were long, her fingers cold as ice. Then, she whispered something that made my stomach drop. "They already know you are here." I pulled my hand back instinctively. The old woman stared at me for a moment longer, her gaze unreadable, before she turned to Masaru and muttered something in their native language. Masaru's expression didn't change. He just nodded. Then, to me, he said, "You should leave before nightfall." I frowned. "Why? Is something going to happen?" Neither of them answered. The old woman just shook her head, mumbling to herself as she stepped back into the shadows of the house. Masaru sighed. "You should not have come here." I wanted to argue, to ask more questions, but something in the air had shifted. The warmth of the home felt colder. The silence between us felt heavier. Outside, the sun had almost completely set. The mountains loomed like black silhouettes against the dimming sky. I had come here looking for a story, for something unique, something lost to time. But for the first time since I arrived, I felt something else. I felt unwelcome. But I wasn't going to leave. Not yet. I had to know more. And I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. That night, I stayed in a small guest house at the edge of the village. It was little more than a wooden shack, its walls thin enough that I could hear every gust of wind rattling through the trees. The bed was hard, the air damp with the scent of rain-soaked wood. Outside, the village was silent, too silent. No voices, no animals, no sounds at all. I tried to sleep, but Masaru's words echoed in my mind. You must never look into their eyes. I kept asking myself, who was he talking about? A ghost? A legend? The villagers clearly feared something, but no one would explain what. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A sound outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling, a shift in the trees. But then, it came again, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something moving across the wooden wall of the guest house. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking outside. A sudden chill swept over me. I glanced toward the window, but the curtains were drawn shut. I hesitated, then slowly reached forward, pulling the fabric aside just an inch. The night outside was pitch black, the village barely visible under the weak glow of the moon. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing at the very edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, too thin. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stood there, staring in my direction. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its form against the dark. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to look away. But I didn't. I leaned in closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The longer I stared, the stranger the figure seemed. Its edges weren't solid. They flickered, shifting like smoke in the wind. Then, just as I was about to step back, it moved, not like a person, not like anything natural. One moment it was standing at the tree line. The next, it was closer, just beyond the fence outside my window. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen it move, hadn't seen it take a single step. But there it was, closer, watching. I blinked, and suddenly there were more of them. 5, no, 6, standing in the field beyond the guest house, motionless, staring. Their bodies flickered, shifting like shadows, like distorted reflections in a broken mirror. I slammed the curtain shut and stumbled back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Don't look into their eyes. The warning rang in my head like an alarm bell. I hadn't seen their faces yet, hadn't seen their eyes. But if I had stayed looking just a second longer, would I have? Outside, the scraping sound returned. Louder, closer. Something was right outside my door. And then, knock. Just once. Software. Almost gentle. I covered my mouth to keep from making a sound. The door creaked, just slightly, just enough that I could see the darkness beyond the threshold. And then, a whisper. Low, faint, right on the other side. Let us in. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my entire body locked in fear. But eventually, the whispering stopped. The knocking stopped. The scraping sound faded into the distance. I didn't dare open the door. I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, my back pressed against the wall, listening to my own shallow breathing. The rest of the night passed in silence. By the time morning came, I wasn't sure if I had imagined all of it. But then I saw the footprints, leading from the trees all the way to my door. The next morning, the village looked normal. The streets were quiet, but not in the same eerie way as the night before. People were out, walking, tending to their daily tasks, speaking in hushed voices. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. The figures in the trees, the whisper at my door, the footprints. I thought about telling someone, Masaru maybe, but I knew what he would say. You were warned. So instead, I kept quiet and tried to convince myself it had been a dream. Sleep paralysis, a trick of the moonlight. Anything but what it really felt like. Then I saw her. A little girl, standing in the middle of the dirt road. She was watching me. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, her small hands clutching something close to her chest, a doll or maybe a bundle of cloth. She was barefoot, pale, and her eyes were locked on mine. A deep, unsettling sense of dread crawled up my spine. Something wasn't right. I gave her a small nod, a weak attempt at a smile, and started to walk past her. But she didn't move. She just kept staring, a little too still, a little too quiet. I tried not to meet her gaze directly, but I felt it. Felt her eyes on me, unblinking, heavy like a weight pressing against my chest. I quickened my pace, and then she whispered something, so soft I almost didn't hear it. I stopped, turned back. Her lips barely moved, but I saw them form the words again. It's too late. A cold wave of nausea swept over me. I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but before I could, she turned and walked away. Not toward any of the houses, not toward any of the paths that led out of the village. She walked toward the trees, the same trees where I had seen them the night before, and just before she disappeared into the shadows, she stopped, turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see the corner of her face, and her eye. It was solid black. Not like a normal eye, not like something human. A void, an absence of light. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The girl disappeared into the forest. I turned and rushed back toward my guest house, my mind racing. But the second I stepped inside, everything went wrong. The room was different. Not physically, nothing had moved. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick, like the walls were closing in. The mirrors, there were 2 of them, one above the sink, another on the wardrobe door, felt off. I looked at the one above the sink. My reflection was normal. But when I glanced at the wardrobe mirror, my reflection wasn't looking back. It was looking past me, behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, just my empty room. But when I turned back to the mirror, my reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. I hadn't moved. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. And then, I blinked, and my reflection was normal again. Breathing heavy, I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag, and bolted out of the guest house. I needed answers. I needed to find Masaru. Because whatever was happening, whatever I had seen last night, whatever had whispered at my door, it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I found Masaru near the village shrine, his usual calm demeanor shifting into something unreadable when he saw me approaching. You saw them, didn't you? He asked, his voice low. I didn't answer right away, because I had seen them. But worse than that, I had looked at them. I need to know what's happening, I said finally. I saw a little girl. She spoke to me. And then, Masaru's expression darkened. A girl. I hesitated. She walked into the trees, I said. And her eyes, they weren't. Masaru grabbed my arm so suddenly that I flinched. You need to leave. His grip tightened. Now. What? Number, I need answers first. There are no answers, Masaru snapped. You looked at them, didn't you? I felt my stomach drop. He already knew. I didn't mean to, I whispered. Masaru let go of my arm and took a step back, running a hand over his face. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, It's already too late. Those were the same words the little girl had said to me, the same words my reflection had mouthed. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing fog of unease. "Tell me what's going on." Masaru exhaled slowly. "In this village, there are things we don't talk about. Things that have always been here. Watching. Waiting." He looked over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the distant tree line. "If you see them, you must never acknowledge them, never react, never meet their gaze." I swallowed hard. "Why?" Masaru turned back to me. "Because the moment you do," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "they know you exist." I felt a deep chill creep up my spine. "You mean, before that, they didn't?" He shook his head. "Not fully. They only sense people who see them, but if you lock eyes with one, if you recognize it, then it recognizes you." My blood ran cold. "So, what happens now?" Masaru didn't answer. Because I already knew. Something was wrong with me. I had felt it since this morning. The heaviness in my limbs, the way my reflection had moved on its own, the way the air seemed thicker around me. Something had changed. Something had followed me back. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the sudden cold. And that's when I noticed it. My shadow. It stretched behind me in the afternoon sun, only it wasn't mine. It was taller. The shape was wrong. I felt my breath hitch. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just empty air. I forced myself to look at Masaru again. "Is there a way to stop this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Masaru hesitated. "There was once, but those who tried never made it back." I clenched my fists. I refused to accept that. There had to be a way. I wasn't going to belong to them. Not yet. Not ever. But as I turned to walk away, I caught sight of something in the window of the nearest house. My reflection. And this time, it wasn't facing the same direction as me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I blinked, every time my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw them. Not clearly, not fully, just hints. A shape shifting in the corner of my vision, a shadow stretching the wrong way, a reflection lagging a second too late. I sat on the floor of my room, knees pulled to my chest, watching the door. Masaru had given me one final warning before I left. Don't let them in. But the truth was, I didn't think I had a choice. The knock came at exactly 3:14 a.m. Soft at first, then again, louder. I held my breath. Then, a voice, right outside my door. A whisper, light as a breath. "You let us see you." I clenched my fists, pressing myself against the wooden floorboards. They weren't real. They weren't real. But when I blinked, my door was open. Not all the way, just enough to see the edge of a face. Dark, hollow, too wide. The whisper came again, curling against my skin like something wet and alive. "It's time." I scrambled backward, heart hammering. And then, they stepped inside. The figure was tall, limbs wrong, joints bending in ways that made my stomach twist. Its face, God, its face. It wasn't a face at all. Just black, endless hollows where the eyes should be. And yet, I felt it staring at me. I turned my head away, squeezed my eyes shut, dug my nails into my palms. Masaru's words ran through my head. Don't acknowledge them. Don't let them know you see. But I had already broken that rule. A hand, long, thin fingers, too many joints, reached toward me. I flinched. And that was enough. It knew I was still aware of it. A horrible, slow grin spread across what should have been its face. I tried to move, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed. The figure crouched beside me, its whisper curling around my ear. "You are ours now." The next moment, I woke up. Morning. Sunlight streaming through my window. The door was shut. Had it been a dream? I sat up slowly, breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. My hands were trembling, my body ached. Then, out of the corner of my eye, my mirror. I turned toward it and froze, because my reflection was still lying down, still curled in the same position I had been before. I woke up, and then it turned its head and smiled.